Well, good morning, everyone, and as we continue our celebration of Black History Month, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome back to St Luke and St Matthew Professor Ron Howell. Ron is the grandson of Bertram Baker, and if you want to know about Bertram Baker, after today's talk by Ron, buy this book. I found it's fascinating. It's about the early history of Bertram and the work of his political work in this area, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and also in the state of New York. So, Ron, thank you for being here, and look forward to what you're going to speak to us this morning.
Thank you very much.
So if you come up here.
Yes, good morning, parishioners.
Good morning.
I am so pleased and honored to be here, to have been invited here. Your Reverend Rector Durbridge and my new buddy, Ian Belizaire, one of your church leaders. It is very, there he is. And I am just pleased at this opportunity. Of course, I'm here on a Sunday of Black History Month, and here to talk to you about someone I think is a forgotten figure in Black history. His name is Bertram L. Baker. And he made history here in Brooklyn by becoming the first Black elected official in Brooklyn. Think about it now. Brooklyn today is acknowledged as the center of Black political power in the city, state, and nation because of the number of Black elected officials. There are scores of Black elected officials in Brooklyn. Hey, Eric Adams, right, started off as a state senator. Bertram Baker was an assemblyman, his equivalent on the other side of the legislature up in Albany. And then Eric Adams became Brooklyn Borough President before becoming the mayor of the city of New York. That's quite an accomplishment. Then there's Hakeem Jeffries, a Brooklyn boy who became a city councilman, then an assemblyman like Bertram Baker, and today is the Democratic leader of the United States House of Democrats in the United States House of Representatives, the first Black person to hold that position. And so many of us, well, across the nation really, are so proud. I believe that if I asked a social gathering, just happened to be getting together, who the first Black person elected to office in Brooklyn was, many, understandably, I think, would say Shirley Chisholm. And she certainly was a Black Brooklyn history maker. First woman to be elected to Congress. She was a member of the Assembly too, like Bertram Baker, and made a run for president. But she began many years after Bertram Baker, and he set the path. Relevant to us today also is that Bert Baker was a member of St. Luke and St. Matthew. He was my grandfather, and the only other time I spoke here at St. Luke and St. Matthew was on March 11th, 1985, at his funeral. It was a final tribute, the last farewell to one who had risen so high. A bit of his background. Bertram Baker was born on the island of Nevis in the Caribbean in 1898. He immigrated here to Brooklyn in 1915. By the way, born in 1898, that was the year of the consolidation of New York City. Before that, Brooklyn was a city. 1898, the year he was born, so something in him when he was a baby was saying, I need to get there. That's where they need me. He immigrated in 1915 here, and in November of 1948, he was elected to the New York State Assembly, representing Bedford-Stuyvesant. which was growing in number back then. Through the 1950s, 1955, actually, he authored one of the nation's first laws making it illegal to discriminate in the sale or renting of housing. Isn't that something? And we still have a long way to go, don't we, regarding racial discrimination in housing. And he would acknowledge that. I'll add too, this is relevant, he became Brooklyn's first black district leader. And he would tell me that more important to him than being elected to the assembly was becoming a district leader. The post of district leader still exists in Brooklyn and throughout the city today, but it's not what it was in Bertram Baker's time, or in the early years of the 1900s, and even going back to the late 1800s in Brooklyn and New York City, which is across the river. District leaders were political bosses. Bosses. Thus came the title of my book, Boss of Black Brooklyn. As the district leader in Black Brooklyn, which was Bedford-Stuyvesant back then, Baker effectively named Brooklyn's first black judges and first black prosecutors who prosecuted cases in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, the first ones. Think of it. Before then, blacks in Brooklyn, and the numbers were growing, by the way, very much the opposite of now. But black person would go into a courthouse and see no one of color, as people say now, who looked like them. And I take some pride in the fact that I've tried to resurrect Bertram Baker in the public mind. The duty of a grandson. And I loved reading this morning about a lantern shining a light in dark places, because I like to think that's what black history should be, not just the making of it, the telling of it as well. And in the regard of resurrecting him in the public mind, 12 years ago I was able to get the street where he lived, Jefferson Avenue, co-named as Bertram L. Baker Way. And here I need to say to you, and I apologize, I think my family members actually understand very much some of the, I would call them either revelations or, confessions from Bertram Baker as he's up there above us about his life. And with me here, by the way, is my wonderful wife who knew Bertram Baker so well as my spouse. He loved her, and he thought he was so pretty, by the way. And my son, Ron Howell, who's Dr. Howell, a surgeon, and he was a baby at the time of Bertram Baker's death, and Bertram Baker would be so proud. But I want to say that in my book, I tell hard truths about Bertram Baker, and you'd have to read them to come up with bullet points of them. But one that stands out was about the male chauvinism, the sexism that was his, and that was of his time. Everyone knows that in the old West Indies, men were they thought they ruled, and women had to be in the home, and that's the way it was in Bertram Baker's household on Jefferson Avenue. Yes, times of deep, deep male chauvinism. And unfairly held back, I feel, and this came out in the book, because it's not just about, blacks, meaning black men, rising. It's about black folks rising. Unfairly held back in life was Bertram Baker's talented wife, Irene, my grandmother. And I'll have to, another confession. Irene Baker was born Irene Baker and became Irene Baker Baker. Why? Because she was his first cousin. That was a confession. She was so meaningful to me. She was a wonderful artist and skilled writer. But she lived her whole life as the housewife in the boss's palace. Yeah, that's the way things were. But let me give some strong praise in this regard to Bertram Baker. He broke down a century-old barrier that had been blocking black men and black women, tennis players across America. You see, Bertram Baker was not much of an athlete. He had kind of a pot belly, in fact, and he was proud of it, because back then it meant that you were doing well, Every once in a while, smoke a cigar and have your belly stick out and you show the world how powerful you were. He was not much of an athlete, but in addition to being a political boss, he was the leader of the American Tennis Association. That was an all-black tennis group with members all across the country, California, New England, all the way through the South, notably Tuskegee, Alabama. And in the 1950s, Baker fought to get white tennis organizations to accept in their competitions a Harlem girl who was black named Althea Gibson, to have her play in all white tournaments. And then in 1957, Gibson made history, winning the finals at the famous Wimbledon tournament in England. It was a proud moment for America, black America, not all Americans necessarily, and for Baker. The mayor of New York City, Robert Wagner, declared there would be a ticker-tape parade along Broadway, and riding with Althea Gibson in the limousine was Bertram L. Baker. Yes, you could see the pride in the very grainy videos, if you can find them on the internet now, of him there in the limousine. I don't need to let you know, because this, of course, very much affects my feelings about Bertram Baker, that I was raised in Bertram Baker's Bedford-Stuyvesant brownstone. He and my grandmother took me and my mother into their brownstone home when I was a child because my father was battling a serious addiction to alcohol. And I've written, too, over the years about my father and the trauma that I believe his being in the segregated United States Marine Corps in the Pacific on a firefighter ship during World War II did to him. Because his folks were from Barbados and they expected to be here and to have equality and a chance to climb the ladder. My father's father, who in fact, veering off, but was an Episcopal priest and rector of St. Barnabas Church back then, which is now in East New York. And he was very, very angry at what happened to my father and his brothers in the segregated army. But my father, yes, was an alcoholic, and Bertram Baker and Irene Baker took me and my mother in and raised me. And I must say that there is some successes regarding my father. He became a member of Alcoholics Anonymous and joined an acting group, a Black Spectrum theater company out in Queens. And he lived a good life, I feel. But I spent my childhood with the boss of Black Brooklyn as my stand-in father. So a legitimate question might come up. Is there an incident maybe on the streets of the boss's community that stayed in my mind? It was an election day in the early 1960s. I was about 11 years old. I was at home in the brownstone practicing baseball with my childhood friend, Johnny Jones, his name was. My grandfather stormed into the house, which was his way of entering the house in any building, by the way, and he ordered me and my friend Johnny to come with him to the voting place over at PS 44. He handed us flyers and told us to give them out to all adults passing by. The message was, of course, vote for Bertram Baker and his people. Bertram Baker is the man. But minutes later, as Johnny and I were out there, we heard somebody screaming at the top of their voice inside the building. We crossed the street to look inside, and here, it was my grandfather yelling like a maniac at a stone-faced white police officer. Baker was accusing the cop of rudely touching one of Baker's female poll workers. The boss pulled out a slip of paper and a pen. He said, "Give me your name." The officer did so, but gripping his nightstick tightly with both hands. The incident ended in silence and people continued voting. As my friend Johnny and I walked back outside to continue giving out more flyers, Johnny's face was frozen. He blurted out, "Boy, your grandfather told that white..." I can't say the word. It begins with an M, the second one is F. But you have to keep in mind that my friend Johnny had migrated just 2 years before from Alabama as part of the Great Migration. And so the sight of seeing my grandfather doing that and hearing him say that and not being arrested, beaten, or lynched stayed with him forever. But I must say too, and this is me, the sometimes suspicious person speaking, but politicians, and Baker too, like many politicians, could have been a great actor on the stage. Yes, he was angry, but he was going to use that anger to show off his feelings to the community and pick up some more votes, which I know he did that day. And that was Bertram Baker as he climbed the ladder. Another question people might ask is, what did God and what did this church, St. Luke and St. Matthew, mean to Bertram Baker? Here's a kind of secret. Bertram Baker came to Brooklyn from Nevis in 1915, not wanting to be a politician, actually, but wanting to be an Episcopal priest. Back then, in his native Nevis, of course, he referred to the priests as Anglicans, and he was probably still using the term when he arrived here, but that was high on his list. And I have a diary that he kept, penciled diary that he kept in 1914 and 15. But what held him back, he said, and redirected him from his goal was learning how racist the Episcopal Church was in Brooklyn. And there's substance to that. Before Bertram Baker came to Brooklyn, his cousin Irene Baker, who became his wife, was already living here. She was born in 1901 in a house off Atlantic Avenue, not far from here. Isn't that something? Brooklyn is in my heart. Her mother, Sarah Baker, had conflicts with Irene's dad, Edwin Baker, about religion. Edwin was a Methodist. One day, Sarah secretly carried baby Irene over to the nearest Episcopal church. That church was St. Matthew's, over on Tompkins Avenue and McDonough Street then. Sarah Baker saw the priest there and requested that he baptize her daughter Irene. The rector said yes, he would baptize baby Irene, but that the baptism could not be entered into the church registry. He said, "There's a church for coloreds." And Irene, my grandmother, related this to me in the 1990s, almost more than 90 years later. And Sarah, I don't even think in many ways ever recovered from that, my great-grandmother. Irene didn't give me the rector's name when she told me all that, but it's in the record that between 1892 and 1926, the rector of St. Matthew was Reverend Henry Swensel. It so happens, I have learned that regarding the church's open racism then, that things only got worse when Rector Swensel died in 1926. Get this, 3 years after his death, in September of 1929, the new rector of St. Matthew's, Rector William Blackshear, gave out a bulletin to his parishioners. And this is what it said. I quote, "The Episcopal Church provides churches for Negroes. Several of these churches are within easy reach of this locality. The rector wrote that. They are in need of the loyal support of all true Negro churchmen. Therefore, the rector of this parish discourages the attendance or membership in this church of the members of that race. I'd like to ask you your reaction, but it's almost have to take a deep breath. And yes, there were a number of colored, quote unquote, churches in Brooklyn in those days. And Bertram Baker and many of his friends in the black community became members of St. Augustine's. And it was an interesting church, I'll have to say, and I need to tell you a little something about the church and its rector. The rector through the 1900s was Rector George Fraser Miller. He was what we would today call a black radical. Imagine that juxtaposed with Blackshear. And you sort of ironic that he had the name Blackshear, right? Blackshear priest. And Rector Miller, as I said, was a black radical, so much so that in the early 1920s at his church, St. Augustine's, the FBI would send hired agents to the church on Sundays to learn what he was saying about black folk and about the country and report back to the federal agency. And he would sometimes say, listen, I know you're here and it doesn't matter because I'm going to tell the truth. I kid you not, this is documented, It's not just my suspicion. George Fraser Miller. So about Bertram Baker, Rector Miller became like a godfather to Bertram Baker. He considered Miller a man of the highest ethical standards. And in 1919, Rector Miller officiated at the wedding of Bertram and Irene Baker. Yes. We learned from history that things change. In 1943, St. Matthew's merged with St. Luke's and made their home at St. Luke's, where we are today. And it was said that a reason for it was embarrassment across the denomination of what the church had been saying to parishioners and how it had been behaving, St. Matthew. And so in 1943, it merged with St. Luke and St. Matthew. But here's the other thing about history. Eventually, Bertram Baker and a number of his political associates, one of them a famous judge who had been appointed by Bertram Baker, his name was Franklin W. Morton, joined with Baker, and many others did too, and switched from St. Augustine to the Episcopal Church of St. Luke and St. Matthew. There was a fire at St. Augustine, and they had differences with the pastor, but he switched to St. Luke and St. Matthew. They did as their place of worship. Isn't that something? There's a certain poetry in history, in black history. And in the time remaining, I want to say a little something too about that man I mentioned, the judge, Franklin Morton, who was a member of St. Augustine with Bert Baker and came over to St. Luke and St. Matthew. What stands out most about my grandfather's funeral in 1985 was that Judge Morton, who owed his job like many of the other judges did, and they were sitting here in the pews with their black robes on out of respect and to honor the man who had passed. Judge Morton was very sick that day, I could tell. He was, sort of huddled up, and when the service was over, he got up and walked out. I guess he felt he had to go home and be in bed. And then as the pallbearers carried the coffin out, right to that door there, Judge Morton was at the steps. And as they put the casket in the hearse, Judge Morton stood behind them. And he tipped his hat with one hand holding his coat in a final honor given to Bertram L. Baker. It was poetic It was extraordinary. And there happened to be there that day a photographer with the New York Times who captured that photo, and you can probably find it. In fact, I have it in the book, and it was in the New York Times and featured from Bertram Baker's funeral here at St. Luke and St. Matthew. The last thing I would say, by the way, about sort of the trends of history is that Franklin Morton stands out because he had a father, Franklin Morton Sr., who in 1920 almost became the first black elected official in Brooklyn. Sometimes I wonder if there was some hidden jealousy in Bertram Baker's heart that he was so, it was an extraordinary moment, 1920, and blacks were just making their way into different offices in New York City widely. But Franklin Morton Sr. ran for New York State Assembly seat in the downtown area. In other words, it would have encompassed around here, 1920. And he had some activists who were behind him, including white activists. Mary White Ovington was one, very famous. And they wanted him to get elected, but he did not want to have his photo shown in the district because many, that's the way things were back then, way before social media, many of the white voters would not have even known that he was a black person. But finally, on election day, the evening of election day, the count was taken and the word went out to the newspapers, notably the Brooklyn Eagle, that Franklin Morton had won, 1920. But the white bosses, political bosses at that time, went to the courts and insisted on a recount. And in that recount, can you believe this? Franklin Morton lost by one vote. One vote. And that was 1920, 28 years before Bertram Baker. You can imagine the pain. Every black resident of Brooklyn would have known that it was stolen from him, and the pain that must have been in the soul of Franklin Morton Sr. and Jr. And so, in closing here, I want to say that history is yes, it's about history makers and learning about them. I heard Jumaane Williams yesterday, and he's a firm example of one who rose to heights after the door was opened by Bertram Baker. Yes, it's that. It's about finding out about them, Shirley Chisholm and so many others. But I hope you'll agree with me today that black history and history in general should also be about the finding out, learning about history, and telling it, as I hope you do and we all do, to our communities, to our children, the generations after us. And I thank you so much for being here and listening to me today, and I feel a special, special bond with you as if Bertram Baker is looking down. Peace be unto you, all of you. Thank you very much.